Hey friend, Chris here from Logic Pro Rules, the website and channel that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Today, I want to show you how one plugin in Logic can be the key to unlocking, dissecting, and even pointing you in a direction for how to EQ the tracks in your projects. So let's say you're working on a vocal, or in this case, a bass guitar or a kick drum. Doesn't really matter what the track type is, but you're trying to massage this track with EQ so it sounds like the sound you have in your head, or at least get it to gel with the rest of the project. And yet, no matter which way you bend and stretch with EQ, it's not sounding that good. Well, the Match EQ really can be the key that allows you to cut through the noise and figure out how to tonally shape these tracks. But it's worth pointing out, the Match EQ by itself won't actually do anything for you. You need to have a reference. So if you have a reference from YouTube or a song you downloaded from iTunes, or in this case, an Apple loop. So I want to show you really the power here with the Match EQ that's often overlooked with this bass guitar. Let's dig into it. On screen, we have a bass guitar at the top. This is the bass with pick track and a drum track stack with multi-track drums inside. This was a project sent to me by a buddy of mine. I'm ultimately going to be mixing the song, but he had asked, hey, can you quantize the drums? So when we record the guitars, the vocals, everything else, all the other instruments would have a tight timing reference to play alongside. Cool, so I quantized the drums, but I thought before I send the project back to him, why don't I add some plug-in processing so the bass and the drums sound, more inspiring to play alongside. So we're going to focus in on the bass guitar at the very top. And I've already applied some plug-in processing in the form of Bass Amp Designer. So I'm using 100% of the direct box in Bass Amp Designer. And then I'm also using the Fat Effects. And here I'm basically pummeling the bass with the compressor. I've also added a dash of distortion and a little bit of a bandpass just so the kick drum had room to play. So I want you to take a listen to the bass as it is. I'll play for you the processing with the Bass Amp Designer and Fat Effects, and there's also a compressor here. It's just sidechained to the kick, so it ducks each and every time the kick drum hits. But let's take a listen to the bass with this plug-in processing and then without. Take a listen. Okay, let's hear it without the Fat Effects and Bass Amp. Okay, so it clearly sounds like a DI. That's fine, but I do like it a lot more with the DI box of Bass Amp Designer and with Fat Effects. Now you'll notice I have a couple other plugins on the channel strip here. We'll dig into those momentarily. At this point, though, I'm feeling like, okay, I dig this bass sound, but I feel like I could further massage the bass with EQ. So of course, I could use any EQ that comes with Logic Pro, but right around the time of me working on this project, the latest version of Logic Pro 11.2 came out. So I was poking around some of the new sound packs that came with the update, specifically the Tosin Abasi sound pack. And I gotta say, a lot of the Apple loops here I thought sounded pretty sick. Take a listen to just a couple of these Apple loops. Of course, Apple loops adapt to the tempo of your project, and this is playing at 180 beats per minute. But I still think that bass riff sounds pretty awesome. Point being is that I ultimately arrived at this Apple loop called Moving Mountains Bass. If we take a listen. I think it sounds great. As it compares to my bass with pick, currently with just Bass Amp Designer and Fat Effects. Cool, so I'm not saying here that one is better than the other. It completely depends on the context of your project and the aspirations you have for a sound and how it fits into the project. But I thought, hey, I dig that Moving Mountains bass. I kind of want to steer my bass guitar towards this direction. That's where Match EQ comes in. So in the next slot after the Fat Effects, I'm going to go right down to EQ and load Logic Pro's Match EQ. So again, the Match EQ in Logic is completely overlooked. One, it's worth pointing out that many folks will pay decent money for an EQ that has this sort of facility, and we have it natively in Logic Pro. It's no extra cost. Number two, there's kind of some baggage when it comes to matching of EQs because one guitar trying to match another, or one bass trying to match another, one vocalist trying to match another. There's a lot of considerations there. There's a lot of different circumstances there, and you may never match effectively, and you may never want to. However, the Match EQ exists for a reason, and that's why you should at least give it a try to see if it can help steer you in a direction so you better understand what you're trying to achieve. That's what I'm going to be doing right now. In a nutshell, the Match EQ is going to try to match my bass guitar to that of the Tosin Abasi Moving Mountains bass in terms of tonality and EQ. All you have to do is click, hold, and drag the region that you want to try to match to a separate source right onto the current tab of the Match EQ. So I'm going to click, hold, and drag right on this tab. Logic Pro is now going to go through an analysis, or essentially an export process, of this bass file. And it's doing a spectral analysis of the bass from beginning to end. Once complete, you get the spectral snapshot of the bass in the current tab. You can click and drag on the left-hand side to get a better view of the spectral analysis. But boom, there's my bass guitar from beginning to end. Also worth pointing out, any plugins in the effect chain will also be part of that export process. So in this case, Bass Amp Designer, Fat Effects, they're going to be included in the snapshot. Once done, all you have to do now is click, hold, and drag your reference onto the reference tab. Obviously, this Apple loop is a lot shorter, so it's a much faster process of analysis. But just to be clear, there's no plugins living on the Moving Mountains bass. This is exactly as it came with the sound pack. And now you can flip between the current and reference tabs so that you can get a visual idea of how these two differ. So there's my bass. So it goes from 20 Hertz, peaks at 100 Hertz, and scales past a little beyond 2K. On the reference tab, okay, we could see that that curve of the Moving Mountains bass is really a bit tighter from 50 Hertz to about 200 Hertz. Right? Then there's a bit of a peak between 500 Hertz and 1K. And it's a little choppier about 2K and above. But at this point, all I have to do is click Match on the EQ Curve tab to match my bass closer to the Moving Mountains bass. Okay, so this is the curve that Match EQ has identified to try to get my bass closer tonally to my reference bass. It looks a little crazy, I know, but let's take a listen to this as it is right now. Before, that's significantly different. I gotta say, the bass now goes from like this middly sort of bass sound to thundering low end. And of course, how does it compare to the Moving Mountains bass? So let's hear before and after. Okay, so not identical. Match EQ is doing the best approximation it can figure out because the Moving Mountains bass seems to have a little more upper energy, and maybe the Match EQ made some erroneous judgments because I think the bassist goes a little higher on the neck later in the song. Of course, this is a much longer performance and has more variation. But for that, I'm just going to add the exciter in Logic Pro here. So I'm just going to add a little bit of harmonics in the upper end just to get a little more articulation out of it. And I'll add the gain plugin. That way, these changes are roughly level matched. So let's hear it one more time. And of course, we'd listen in context with the drums, but we're listening to just the bass right now so you can clearly hear what's going on. Now, let's say that you're feeling like, Chris, this is way too aggressive. These EQ changes are too much. It's taking my track way too far in a direction that doesn't sound good. Well, there are further controls you can use to refine these adjustments. So the apply slider allows you to either reduce the amount of EQing going on. Here, it can be much more gentle, less aggressive of a change, or you can go in the opposite direction and really emphasize these changes. Let me set the apply slider to 0%, and then I'll start to dredge it up. and I'll try to find a place where it sounds a little less intense. So at 70, 80%, that might be a better fit. Now, there's also an option to adjust the extremes of the low end and the high end. Right in the upper left-hand corner is the fade extremes. And with this, you can back off on the EQing of the low or the high end. So I'm going to back this off completely. But perhaps that 10 or 15 dB reduction in the high end is a little too much. So I could just try to eliminate that completely. Let me bypass the exciter and we'll take a listen. Cool. I'll bring everything back. And the third control to get familiar with is the smoothing function of the Match EQ. By dragging the smoothing slider to the left-hand side, you can really emphasize each and every single EQ adjustment the Match EQ could impose onto your track. And on the right-hand side, the EQ adjustments are much more gentle and general. Let's start at the left-hand side so we hear the Match EQ at its most extreme, and then we'll hear the gentle version to the right. Isn't it incredible how much tonal variation there is just with the EQ? I mean, it's just the EQ. It's just bending and stretching what already exists. And yet we get two completely different versions of the bass. Personally, I'm really digging the sound of this bass. I'm pretty impressed with what has been achieved here by just using an Apple loop as a reference. But of course, if you don't want to use the Match EQ to do your EQing for you, but you're looking for just, a direction, a guiding light for how to approach your tracks, well, you can just use the Match EQ to start and then make the adjustments yourself using the channel EQ or other EQs that you like to use. Here I've done basically the same thing as the Match EQ with the two channel EQs, but they're much more gentle and general. So I'll move the exciter after, just for the sake of doing it, and we'll take a listen one more time. So that's the power of Match EQ. And just keep in mind, I used an Apple loop that came for free with Logic Pro. That's how awesome these sounds are in the Apple loop section. Even if you don't use loops, just give it a poke. Just take a look, take a listen. There might be something really inspiring there, creatively or tonally. Perhaps there's a reference track that you've been listening to and you're like, man, that vocal, that bass, that drum, it sounds amazing. I really wish I could hear it better so I could have a better idea of how to shape my drums, my vocal, my bass. Well, of course, since Logic Pro 11 and now Logic Pro 11.2, we have the improved stem splitter, and you could split up your reference track into different stems so you could hear that bass, that vocal, that drum. In this case, I'm going to stem split the vocals, drums, bass, and guitar from this reference track and apply. And boom, now I have a bass track that I'm inspired by, and I can hear the bass from that file and use Match EQ again to dissect how can I possibly maybe achieve a similar tone. There you go. The Match EQ, an overlooked tool in Logic Pro, can be the key to you unlocking and figuring out how to tonally shape the tracks in your projects. Whether it's bass from a reference track, an Apple loop, or using Stem Splitter to split out tracks. It's an amazing tool. And of course, you don't always want to take it verbatim, but at least it can give you a clue for how to achieve the sound that you're after. So I hope you take more advantage of the Match EQ if you haven't already, and I'll check you for more later. Take care.